Once again, we just see Dr. Ortlund being completely disingenuous. You are not, I stand by the title of my original video. You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in advancing Protestantism. That's not the truth. That's not seeking the truth. That's not being willing to die for the truth. That's having an agenda and being willing to die for your agenda.
What will people do if they find that it's true? I don't really care if they label me a Jesus freak. There ain't no disguising the truth.
Hey everyone, welcome to Catholicism Wow. So Dr. Gavin Ortlund commented on my video rebutting him on church authority, and the actual thesis of his video was how to choose a Protestant denomination, but it really comes down to church authority, and that's basically what I explained in my video. And apparently Dr. Ortlund took issues with some of the things that I said in my video. So let's take a look at the comment that Dr. Ortlund left and respond to it. It is better to engage in criticism without questioning motive or charging dishonesty without good reason, as you unfortunately do in this video. Regarding Mary's assumption, if you are going to charge me with making an argument from silence, the least you can do is engage my video entitled Why Mary's Assumption is Indefensible, where that is the first misunderstanding I ward off. And he has a timestamp, so we will definitely take a look at that in this video. It is not an argument from silence, but an argument from positive data from the first 4 centuries of church history. Also, the Catholic Catechism is not a list of essential doctrines. It is a fallible compendium of doctrine comparable to the statements of faith in particular Protestant traditions. Hence, Catholic theologians will disagree regarding which part of it are essential to believe to be saved. There were other problems with this video, but the most unfortunate, again, is the charge of dishonesty. Contrary to the title of this video, I am interested in the truth, and I would, in fact, gladly give my life to seek and promote it. So was I unfair to Dr. Ortlund when I said he wasn't actually interested in the truth? I don't think I was. I think I showed it very clearly in my last video. But we will absolutely show it here again. Dr. Ortlund, whether it's intentional or not, is intellectually dishonest. He cherry picks comments. He dismisses evidence without looking at the preponderance of that evidence, or even without dealing with the evidence itself in a lot of cases. And we will see all of those things in this video. So I went through and I got one of Dr. Ortlund's older videos on the papacy to illustrate my point about how he doesn't actually seek the truth. He seeks to bend the truth to fit what he already wants to believe. And we're going to take a look at that video in a moment. But first, to placate Dr. Ortlund, we're going to take a look at the video that he asked me to engage with, specifically just the snippet that deals with the argument from silence charge that I made about his denying of the assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, it should be noted that Dr. Ortlund, for some reason, fixated on this one thing that I said in my video, which basically was like a throwaway thing. It had really nothing to do with the thesis of my video or of his. But since he feels unfairly criticized and he thinks that what he says in this Marian video is somehow relevant to that topic, we will take a look at it.
One of the responses is people say that this is an argument from silence and therefore it is not conclusive. But from what we've already recounted, we can note that this actually isn't a problem or an argument from silence. It's an argument from silence plus positive, specific, and diverse historical data that makes the Assumption of Mary very unlikely. People unsuccessfully inquiring into whether there's any known tradition about Mary's end. Texts that speak about the Assumption as a late arrival. References to Mary as currently separated from her body. The diversity of accounts when it does show up. Okay, none of that is silence. And I want to reiterate this point because it's so important. The historical argument against the bodily assumption of Mary is not an argument from silence. It's an argument from silence combined with other historical points of data that make it very unlikely. Silence is a feature of the argument, but it's not the full argument.
So right off the bat, the title of Dr. Ortlund's video is Why the Assumption of Mary is Indefensible. But it's not indefensible by his own arguments. It's, in his own words, unlikely. Even highly unlikely. That doesn't make something indefensible. For it to be indefensible, you would have to have irrefutable proof that the Virgin Mary was not bodily assumed into heaven. You would have to basically produce a corpse. You would have to have eyewitness testimony that says, yes, she was dead, we buried her, and she was still dead 7 years later, still in the tomb, still where we left her. But that's not what you see. What you see when you look through history, when you look through the earliest accounts of Mary and her life, you have you may not have the assumption the way it was all put together by the 5th or the 6th century and universally believed throughout the church, but you have, at the very least, a mystery. We don't know. She was dead. We buried her. The tradition is that St. Thomas the Apostle went to her tomb 3 days later to view her body, to give her respects, to mourn her, and the tomb was empty. She was gone. Also, what Dr. Ortlund claims to be positive evidence is actually nothing of the sort. All it is him ignoring actual positive evidence and focusing on misrepresenting what he considers to be the positive evidence that Mary died, that her soul was separated from her body. None of those things refute the idea of the Assumption, because the Assumption narratives allow for that she died. The earliest Assumption narratives that we have come from the East. Eastern Christians, the Orthodox and Eastern rites in the Catholic Church, have always held to stories called the palm narratives. The palm narratives are stories that entail or that detail the angel Gabriel visiting the Blessed Virgin at the end of her life and telling her that her time on the earth has come to an end, and giving her a palm leaf from the tree of life in paradise. Dr. Ortlund plainly claims that all of the scholarship says that there wasn't anything even remotely close to the Assumption of Mary told in the church before the 5th, 6th, or even the 7th centuries. And that's just an outright misrepresentation of the scholarship. Stephen Shoemaker, who Dr. Ortlund in this very video attributes as being one of the best scholars on the Assumption of Mary and on Marian theology in general. Dr. Ortlund speaks highly of Stephen Shoemaker in this video, and Dr. Ortlund misrepresents what Stephen Shoemaker's findings actually are. In the same book that Dr. Ortlund quotes, Stephen Shoemaker dates the palm narratives, the actual manuscripts that we have, to the 5th century. However, he does outline how those manuscripts are very probably copies, and he is confident in dating the palm narratives to as early as the 2nd century. Stephen Shoemaker in that same book has also dated the Book of Mary's Repose, which is an apocryphal text, but it's not a heretical text. He dates that confidently, he says. He says we can confidently date this to the 3rd century or maybe even earlier. We see that Dr. Ortlund is using the same tactics against the Assumption of Mary that atheists will use against the resurrection of Christ or against the Bible itself. It is clear, just as the title of my last video states, that Dr. Ortlund is not interested in the truth as he claims. He is only interested in proving his side, proving his point, keeping people Protestant, defeating the Catholic claims. That's all he's interested in. And I'm going to play a video now to show evidence of that. This comes from a channel called Agnus Domini. It's a relatively new channel. It's their first video dates back only 2 months. And he seems to have made it his job to destroy Dr. Ortlund. And in doing research for this video, I happened upon his channel. I happened upon this video where Dr. Ortlund tries to ascribe the doctrine of sola scriptura as having been held by St. John Chrysostom, which is ridiculous. And I found this clip fascinating. So I'm going to play it for you. It's a relatively long clip, but I'm going to try and cut it up and make it a little shorter while still keeping everything significant intact. But I would definitely recommend you go to Agnus Domini's channel, subscribe, watch his videos. He gets way more views than I do. So go give him some more views. He is making great content so far. So here's a clip from Agnus Domini.
From his 33rd homily on Acts, he's basically, in the context, he's talking about heresy, and he's saying, don't be alarmed when heresy springs up, because it means God is doing something good. Whenever the true gospel is preached, there will be offenses and evils and false views that surround it and also start growing, and the good and bad are growing together. And so then he envisages this scenario of, what about when a pagan is coming to the church and doesn't know which side to believe? And this is exactly the kind of scenario people often leverage against Protestants as grounds why we need an infallible magisterium. Well, because the pagan is wondering, okay, who's right? Like, are the Arians right, or is the other side right? So listen to how he poses and then answers this scenario. What then shall we say to the heathen? There comes a heathen and says, I wish to become a Christian, but I know not whom to join. There is much fighting and faction among you, much confusion. Which doctrine am I to choose? How shall we answer him? Each of you, says he, asserts, I speak the truth. Now here's how John responds. No doubt this is in our favor. For if we told you to be persuaded by arguments, you might well be perplexed. But if we bid you believe the scriptures, and these are simple and true, the decision is easy for you. If any agree with the scriptures, he is a Christian. If any fight against them, he is far from this rule.
So what we have now is Saint Chrysostom claims that one is only a Christian if one agrees with the scriptures. Therefore, one should prove himself right based on the scripture, which is simple and true. So Chrysostom is confident that should someone read the scriptures, they would come to agree with him. Now, let's have a look at all the wild extrapolations that Gavin Ortlund draws from this single quote without the full context. The very same context of the same homily, which will refute him in a minute.
Now notice, first of all, that John erects the scriptures as the ultimate test by which to measure these competing claims within the church. Secondly, he distinguishes at a practical level the scriptures from arguments on the grounds that arguments will confuse the person, whereas the scriptures are simple and true.
Let's address his points one by one. First, Gavin claims that Chrysostom erects the scriptures as the ultimate test. I agree, however I want to note that he does not do so at the exclusion of another authority. He uses the scripture as the ultimate test in this circumstance, so Gavin's wording is already slightly misleading. Second, Gavin says that Chrysostom believes the scriptures to be sufficient to prove his point, clearly without need for arguments. I agree. This is what Chrysostom is saying. Ironically though, Chrysostom believed in works salvation, infant baptism, baptismal regeneration, Petrine primacy, apostolic succession, and the bishopric, since he himself was a bishop, the Bishop of Constantinople. From Gavin's point of view, either Chrysostom was right and therefore Protestantism is false, or Chrysostom is false about the scripture plainly proving him right, which would end up refuting the clarity of scripture that Ortlund is trying to cling onto. Can you see how Gavin is picking and choosing what he likes from the fathers, even if it ends up self-contradicting? Third, he makes this pathetic argument.
Thirdly, notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, yeah, there's all these competing options. That's why you need an infallible magisterium to adjudicate between them.
This is just a really bad argument from silence that makes no sense. According to Gavin, it's somehow worth noting that in a dispute about who is right, Chrysostom doesn't appeal to the thing in question. So basically, Gavin's argument is that Chrysostom did not embarrass himself by begging the question in his argument. If a heathen converts to Christianity and sees a Catholic argue with a Protestant about faith alone, what good would it be for the Catholic to appeal to church authority when that is the very thing in question, because the Protestant is by proxy denying Catholic authority when he disagrees with Catholic dogma? How stupid does Gavin think Chrysostom is? Just like in my last video concerning his distortion of Augustine, he seems to believe that the saints he quotes are imbeciles based on the words he is putting in their mouth. Once again, his line of argumentation is presupposing that the saints would make ridiculous and fallacious arguments all the time. So the only reason why Chrysostom didn't appeal to church authority in this moment is not because it makes no sense in context and is just a bad argument. No, it's because he doesn't believe in church authority, according to Gavin Ortlund. Now, of course, Saint Chrysostom is actually a genius, so he argues without committing embarrassing fallacies, which is to appeal to common ground, the scripture, in order to determine who is correct. Can you guys see how biased Ortlund is already? How can anyone who's not really just blinded by his preconceived beliefs unironically raise such bad arguments from silence?
All right, so when Dr. Ortlund left his original comment, I did comment a written response to it. And in that written response, I told him that, I pointed out his dishonest tactics that he uses. And I said, anyone who watches your videos can plainly see this. And to that, he responded, anyone who watches your videos can see this. That's a quote from my comment. This is not the typical reaction to my videos. You are overconfident in asserting something to be obvious and perspicuous here when it is in fact a minority position. Yet we see Agnus Domini pointing out the very same intellectually dishonest tactics. Not only that, but William Albrecht has pointed out and has exposed Dr. Ortlund on these same dishonest tactics. So it may not be, and if you look at the comments section of either of those channels' videos, you will see so many viewers that are in agreement that, yes, they've noticed Dr. Ortlund doing that as well. So it may not be that it's a minority opinion. It may just be, Dr. Ortlund, that you are ignoring the criticism and that the Catholics that you choose to engage with are just too nice to point it out to you to your face. But this video gets better, so let's get back to it.
John then proceeds to anticipate all these various possible maneuvers that this heathen person could make and how you should try to convince them at each turn. And throughout, he's assuming the ability to convince this person. At one point, he even questions their sincerity if they cannot see the truth between these different competing claims within the church. He says, quote, if he should say what you say about the Christians, there is such a multitude of men and they have different doctrines, this a heathen, that a Jew, the other a Christian, no need to accept any doctrine whatever, for they are at variance with one another. But I am a learner and do not wish to be a judge. But if you have yielded so far as to pronounce against one doctrine, this pretext no longer has place for you. For just as you were able to reject the spurious, so here also having come, you shall be able to prove what is profitable. And a bit further, let us not make pretexts and excuses, and all this will be easy. See, at no point in here does John think You need the church's the church's infallible magisterium to come in and adjudicate between these different options. He's assuming this person has the ability to judge which is right and which is wrong. And he clearly articulates that the scriptures are the ultimate judge over that task. In fact, he goes on to say, basically, if this heathen person maneuvers the conversation to a place of total skepticism, like I can't decide between these different options, they're just making excuses.
I agree thus far. Chrysostom is accusing those who are not persuaded by the clear teaching of Scripture of making excuses. But why does he do that? Because he is saying that those who don't clearly see that the Bible teaches what the Church teaches are biased and prejudiced. I quote, "It cannot be that he who hears without prejudice should not be persuaded. For just as, if there were a rule by which everything behooved to be put straight, it would not need much consideration, but it would be easy to detect the person who measures falsely. So is it here. Then how is it they do not see it at a glance? Many things are the cause of this, both preconceived opinion and human causes. The others say the same thing about us." So he's saying that one would come to agree with him at first glance, lest one is biased by preconceived opinion and human causes. But both sides accuse each other of having those preconceived opinions and human causes. How can you tell who is the one that is biased by heresy? St. Chrysostom has an answer for you. Quote, "For are we separated from the Church? Have we our heresiarchs? Are we called after men? As one of them has Marcion, another Manichaeus, a third Arius, for the author and leader of his sect. Whereas if we likewise do receive an appellation from any man, we do not take them that have been the authors of some heresy, but men that presided over us and governed the Church." So in case anyone needs me to spell this out for you, Chrysostom is appealing to the church governance to prove that he is not the one in heresy, but rather it is those who follow the innovations of heretics like Arius and Marcion, whose followers are named after them. Does this not remind you of Protestant innovations like Calvinism or the denomination named Lutheranism named after Martin Luther? He is claiming that we are sure to have the true interpretation of Scripture because we do not follow the patriarchs of heresy, which would bias us and render us unable to understand the Scriptures correctly. Gavin, I'm afraid he's talking about people like you. You're part of a denomination that is named after their false doctrines concerning believers' baptism, which Chrysostom directly contradicts in the quote on screen. When St. John Chrysostom is talking about biased people who refuse to understand Scripture correctly and make excuses not to convert to the true church, he's talking about you. You make a living off of spreading what Chrysostom would have considered heresy. Those are your human causes, which Chrysostom is talking about. You were trained in seminaries by people whom Chrysostom would have considered the followers of heresiarchs, like Luther, who taught salvation doctrine contradictory to Chrysostom's salvation teaching. From this point of view, you literally have a PhD in heresy from an evangelical seminary and a master in heresy from the Calvinist Presbyterian seminary, which is equally heresy to St. Chrysostom. It does not get any more biased than you, Gavin, especially when we consider how selectively he reads this text. When I found this out, I was really convicted to humiliate and expose Gavin's deceptive tactics. No amount of superficial charity, which everyone always praises him for, can make up for this disgusting and deceitful approach to Chrysostom's text. Look at this. Just look at this. In red is what Gavin has quoted, and in blue is what I have quoted, in addition to what he quoted. Do you see how he stops his quoting literally a sentence before St. Chrysostom starts talking about church authority and which group is the true church? This is getting me close to accusing him of intentionally lying to his audience. How dishonest is it to make an argument from silence based on St. Chrysostom not mentioning church authority, while you leave out the part where he does mention church authority? Gavin either did zero research or is straight up lying and deceiving. In either case, this blunder alone should be a career-ending embarrassment, and Gavin needs to publicly apologize for this video. This is just disgusting.
Literally one sentence after where Dr. Ortlund's quote of St. John Chrysostom stops, literally one sentence later, that same homily by St. John Chrysostom completely destroys everything that Dr. Ortlund was trying to attribute to him about sola scriptura. And not only that, but Dr. Ortlund was trying to make an argument from silence, saying that at no time does St. John Chrysostom ever appeal to the church, while blatantly ignoring when he does appeal to the church and to the authority of the church. So he quote mines the fathers, he quote mines the scholars, he quote mines and misrepresents the Bible, and yet we're supposed to believe that Dr. Ortlund is interested in actually finding the truth and that he would give his life to find and to speak the truth. I don't buy it. I'm sorry. I don't buy it. Dr. Ortlund, you're dishonest.
Moreover, let me say something about arguments from silence. Arguments from silence can have plausibility value to the extent that you expect the sources in question not to be silent. So let me give a metaphor to prove this point to help people envision this. Suppose that you're driving in your car and on the radio there's a reference to a school shooting. And the radio doesn't specify which school, so you're worried about your kids. You drive to the school your kids go to, and you walk around campus and just ask people, have you heard anything about a shooting here? Now, if the school has 2,000 students and is on a 10-acre campus, and you interview 10 people, and none of them have heard of such a thing, this will probably relieve you a little bit. That'll help you a little bit. It will reduce the plausibility to a certain degree. But if the school has only 500 students and is on a 3-acre campus, and you interview 50 different people from different parts of the campus, including several teachers and staff, and none of them have heard of a school shooting happening, your confidence and your relief will be much further. In neither case is it a logical deduction. You can always say it's logically possible that somehow there's nobody heard of it. But the point is that the more you expect particular sources not to be silent about a particular event, the more relevant that is to the plausibility of that event.
This is another thing that Dr. Ortlund likes to do. And I will show another clip of him doing it again later on, is he likes to use analogies to illustrate his point, but the analogies are not analogous to what he's trying to analogize. Like, a school shooting is a catastrophic event, okay? And beyond that, a school shooting today is not comparable to a religious narrative from 2,000 years ago, because we're much, much closer to the school shooting than we are to the Dormition and the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And beyond that, there are not examples of these early church fathers being asked about the Assumption of Mary and saying that they've never heard of it. So that they've never heard of it is something that you're inferring into their silence. It's not something that is that you can actually show. You're just making it up. You're imprinting that onto the argument from silence, and you're saying, well, if this many people have not heard of a school shooting, then there probably wasn't a school shooting. And you're trying to say, well, if this many people never heard of the Assumption of Mary, then there probably was an Assumption. But you don't know that they never heard of it because nobody is actively asking them, hey, did you hear about this? It would be like if, okay, a proper analogy, and this isn't even an exact proper analogy, because again, it doesn't defeat that we're closer to the event than we were to the Assumption of Mary. It doesn't defeat the other objections that I brought up. But it would be like if your kids came home and didn't say anything about there being a shooting at their school. Then you could, ideally assume that there wasn't a shooting at their school, because that would be the first thing they told you when they came home, right? And yeah, maybe it's possible that they weren't in the wing of the school that had the shooting, but that would be much more analogous than you going around asking 50 people in different parts of the school, because there is no analogy to that in the early church. There's no record of someone asking and saying, I've never heard of that before. So, you're filling in the gaps of the silence and trying to make it fit what you want it to say. And again, that's dishonest.
Many people recognize that arguments from silence can have some degree of value because they will appeal to the fact that we have no relics for Mary. And that's a form of an argument from silence. Now, I don't think that is particularly effective, because it's not particularly surprising that we don't have any relics from Mary. There's lots of people we have no relics from. We don't have any relics from Joseph either. And that doesn't mean he was assumed to heaven.
And here we see another dishonest tactic that Dr. Ortlund tends to fall back on quite a bit. He makes wild assertions that he can't possibly back up and just states them as if they're the truth. There are lots of people we don't have relics for. Really? Who? Other than Joseph. He name drops Joseph. That's not many people. That's one. And as far as I know, Mary and Joseph are the only prominent New Testament figures that we don't have relics for. We don't seem to have relics for Old Testament figures, but that's because the veneration of relics is a New Testament thing. Not that it was unheard of in the Old Testament at all, because they did have the Ark of the Covenant. They did keep in the Ark of the Covenant the Ten Commandments, the staff of Aaron, some manna from heaven. It's not that Old Testament relics didn't exist, but they haven't survived into the New Testament era. And so all the relics that we do have are Christian relics. We don't have Jewish relics. We have Christian relics, and they're all from the New Testament era. And we've got relics of all of the apostles. We've got relics of, almost there are some things that are lost to time. The spear of Longinus is lost to time. There are some relics that don't exist anymore. But we do have relics from every prominent New Testament figure except Mary and Joseph. And Mary and Joseph are both members of the Holy Family. So it's not implausible that Joseph might have been assumed into heaven. That's just not something that the church teaches. But I mean, if some random Catholic wanted to believe that, it wouldn't be official teaching, but I wouldn't be able to tell them they're wrong, because it makes sense. And that's another thing, and we will get to that later. But in one of his videos that we're going to look at, Dr. Ortlund does specifically say, I think it's the video on the papacy that we're going to look at, but Dr. Ortlund does give Catholics credit for being better at logic and reason than Protestants are.
Kind of 5 things that I admire about my Catholic friends. In fact, things I would say, as I've been on my own study of engaging Catholic theology, things that I think Catholics, generally speaking, obviously these are generalizations, do better than Protestants. So number 1, philosophy and logic, especially in the Thomist tradition, and a lot of evangelicals are kind of iffy on philosophy, which is unfortunate.
So why don't you listen to our logic and our reason? It makes logical sense that Mary would be assumed into heaven because she was the mother of God. She was Jesus Christ's mother. Why would Jesus Christ not want to protect his mother from her body decaying in a tomb somewhere? It just makes logical sense that he would give the greatest gift he could to his mother, that of a bodily assumption. So if you're going to give Catholics praise for logic and reason and how we use it, then maybe pay attention to how we use it, because you're right. We do, our doctrines do make logical sense.
But the point is, we should be consistent in whether or not we allow arguments from silence to play a role in our thinking. We've got to have it both ways. One of the examples that Trent mentioned in his video from a year ago, actually, I think, though it might have come up, I can't remember, is this point that the Exodus in the Old Testament is another historical event that doesn't have external testimony out of Scripture. And so the idea here is like, just as a Protestant can accept the testimony of Scripture on the Exodus, a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox Christian can accept the Assumption of Mary without external confirmation on the authority of the Church. But these two events are disanalogous because the Exodus took place 12 or 14 centuries earlier, when we have much less historical documentation of any kind.
So the Assumption of Mary, or any New Testament event, is disanalogous to the Exodus because they happened 1,400 years apart, but you thought that your school shooting analogy was completely valid in comparison to the Assumption of Mary, even though those two events would have happened 2,000 years apart. Got it.
So it's much less surprising that we wouldn't have external confirmation. But in the case of Mary's Assumption, it's very surprising because we have not only numerous references to Mary's death, as we've seen, people searching for traditions about what happened to her at the end of her life, but we also have numerous lists of the people that are understood to have been assumed bodily to heaven. I'll go through a number of these. When Tertullian is expounding the perfection of the resurrection body, he lists Enoch and Elijah as his examples of those who are translated to heaven. Elsewhere, when he's defending the view that the debt of sin includes death, he gives two exceptions to that, Enoch and Elijah. There's two other passages in Tertullian where he's basically discussing Elijah's assumption, the nature of heaven, the nature of the resurrection body. Mary never comes up. When Irenaeus wants to list examples of those who are translated to heaven to prove that God can resurrect our physical bodies, he lists Enoch and Elijah. No mention of Mary. When Methodius wants to defend the resurrection of the body, he distinguishes between those who rose to die again, like Lazarus, and those who were taken up to immortality, like Enoch and Elijah. Again, no mention of Mary. When Origen lists exceptions to the general pattern of death, he mentions Enoch and Elijah, not Mary. When the Apostolic Constitutions, which is a 4th century compilation of texts dealing with church orders, appeals to examples of the power of God in raising the dead, it mentions Enoch and Elijah. Again, no mention of Mary. When John Chrysostom wants to prove that bodily existence does not make virtue impossible, he appeals to those who do great deeds in the flesh and then are translated to heaven. His examples? Enoch and Elijah, not Mary. When Cyril of Jerusalem lists examples of those who are not greater than John despite being bodily raised to heaven, it's Enoch and Elijah, not Mary. Later he references Jesus' ascension and references Enoch and Elijah's translation to heaven, as well as Paul's travel to heaven, as well as the story of Habakkuk's translation from Israel to Babylon, which was a myth that some believed. Still, Mary never comes up. When Jerome wants to exposit the nature of the resurrection body, he gives examples. It's Enoch and Elijah, not Mary. When Ambrose wants to list those who are caught up to be alive with Christ, he lists Enoch and Elijah, along with Paul and some apostles, but not Mary. When Augustine references Faustus's belief that Elijah, Moses, and Enoch were bodily assumed to heaven, it's just those three, and then later he himself references Caelestius's question about the location of Enoch and Elijah, and he rebukes him for asking that. Mary never comes up. So the point is, the church fathers are not silent about listing people who are assumed to heaven. There's plenty of times where you'd expect that somewhere this is going to come up, that, well, it wasn't just Enoch and Elijah. Actually, the most important person, the most important creature, Mary, the Queen of Heaven, she also was assumed to heaven. You'd kind of think that would come up somewhere.
Curious, Dr. Ortlund, who else do we know that was assumed into heaven, body and soul, and isn't mentioned in the majority of those lists? Oh, right, Jesus. Now, you could argue that Jesus ascended under his own power and that Enoch and Elijah didn't and Mary didn't, but if you're going to say that their silence on Mary is an indication that she wasn't assumed into heaven, then you also have to say that their silence on Christ has to be a contradiction that Christ didn't ascend into heaven. Once again, like you said, you can't have it both ways. What was it that you said?
But the point is, we should be consistent in whether or not we allow arguments from silence to play a role in our thinking.
And another person that we have good reason to believe was assumed into heaven, Moses, also isn't on any of those lists. It's almost like they only pulled from what was actually in the sacred scripture of the time, and the New Testament canon hadn't been codified yet. So, I mean, it's not. This is not a refuting rebuttal. This is not evidence that it didn't happen. This is just evidence that it isn't in those lists. But neither is Jesus. Neither is Moses. I mean, do you really think these are good arguments? Do you really? Because, I mean, I don't.
It's just Enoch and Elijah, sometimes Moses, sometimes Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. Eusebius has another passage where he lists the possible assumption to heaven of an old bishop named Chaereman. Of course, Jesus' ascension to heaven is frequently discussed, yet nowhere do you get any idea of an assumption to Mary. Now, some of these passages you could explain this or that way. You could say maybe the author just chose not to include Mary as an example. He's just choosing Enoch and Elijah. Maybe he's speaking strictly of those assumed to heaven without an intervening death, and they thought Mary was buried and then assumed. Okay, fine. Maybe they're focused just more on the Old Testament figures. Trent mentioned some of these possible explanations. He mentioned Clement and Methodius and several others. Okay, maybe that can work for some of these texts, but for all of them? If Mary is as important in the early church as she is in Roman Catholic theology, and in the theology of other churches as well, is it really plausible that she would be bodily assumed to heaven and it would simply never be mentioned in Tertullian, Irenaeus, Methodius, Origen, the Apostolic Constitutions, John Chrysostom, Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, Cyril of Jerusalem, etc., when they're literally telling you, here's the people who were bodily assumed to heaven, and they don't include her. So that's the way the argument from silence works. It's not conclusive, but what you do is you take that argument from silence, which is suggestive, and then you stack on top of it 5 things. Number 1, all the references to Mary's death early on, none of which indicate anything out of the ordinary, and several of which reference her as having left her body. That's not silence. Number 2, stack on top of that the testimony of Epiphanius and others like Isidore of Seville concerning the ultimate uncertainty of her end, despite careful investigation into the matter. That's not silence. Number 3, you stack on top of that the diversity of the accounts when they do show up. Number 4, the acknowledgments of its late arrival. And number 5, the fact that it seems to originate in heterodox contexts like the Book of Mary's Repose. And what happens is the combination of the deafening silence on the one hand, plus all of these other suggestive features, ultimately yield that I would say Eamon Duffy was right. The best synthesis of the data is simply to yield to plausibility, yield to what truth seems to be, that the assumption of Mary was unknown in the early church.
All right, so let's deal with Dr. Ortlund's 5 points of what he claims is positive evidence that he has stacked on top of the deafening silence on Mary's assumption in the early church. So number 1, Mary's death. The several accounts that he's mentioned that refer to the falling asleep of Mary, Mary's soul being separated from her body, etc., etc. Who cares? That's the answer to that one. Who cares? None of that matters. None of that matters, because the church in the doctrine of the Assumption acknowledges that she may have died first. And the earliest traditions that we have show that she did die. Like in the Palm narratives, she dies. And this is exactly why St. Thomas didn't go to see her until 3 days later to find her tomb empty. Because in the Palm narratives, she dies. She's given a Christian burial, a Christian funeral by the apostles, minus Thomas, because for some reason he wasn't there. They seal her up in her tomb. Thomas arrives 3 days late. He wants to pay his respects to her, and boom, she's gone. So the fact that there are accounts of her death is completely irrelevant. So we'll scratch that one off the list, and now you're down to 4. Epiphanius does say that that he is uncertain as to Mary's ultimate end, but again, he doesn't say that she's dead, or he doesn't say that she is encapsulated in a tomb somewhere. And doesn't it stand to reason, Dr. Ortlund, that we have all these graves, all these tombs preserved of all these New Testament figures? We wouldn't have Mary's tomb preserved. There wouldn't be a church built on top of it right now. We do have Mary's tomb preserved. It's empty. Both of them. There are 2 places she may have been buried. They're both empty. And beyond that, St. Epiphanius does actually affirm Mary's assumption. And I know you have an answer to this too, so we'll play that clip as well. But St. Epiphanius writes, like the bodies of the saints, however, she has been held in honor for her character and understanding. And if I should say anything more in her praise, she is like Elijah, who was virgin from his mother's womb, was always remained so, and was taken up, but has not seen death. So St. Epiphanius clearly compares the Blessed Virgin Mary to Elijah. And that virgin from the mother's womb, same as Mary, always remained so perpetually, same as Mary, and was taken up and has not seen death, same as Mary. But let's take a look at your argument against this quote.
Okay. Well, here, the quote as it stands, what he's saying is he's arguing against the Collyridians who were offering sacrifices to Mary and worshiping her. And he's saying basically, and I'm not arguing that this is against Catholicism right now. I know Catholics don't worship Mary, but he's saying we don't worship Mary, we just worship God. He compares Mary to 3 people, Elijah, Thecla, and John. And the statement about Elijah is if I should say anything more in Mary's praise, she is like Elijah, who was virgin from his mother's womb, always remained so, was taken up, has not seen death. She is like John, who leaned on the Lord's breast, the disciple whom the Lord loved. She is like Thecla, etc., etc., etc. The relative clause there, who was taken up, is talking about Elijah. And it's so like a comparable sentence would be, George W. Bush was an honorable man, like his father, George H. Bush, comma, who served 1 term. The relative clause is not exhaustive for everything in the sentence preceding it, and it's the same with the next sentence about John. So I have to just state my opinion about that. I don't think Epiphanius is talking about Mary at all with the bodily assumption. I think he's talking about Elijah's bodily assumption, and the comparison between those 2 is not comprehensive any more than it is with John or Thecla. With the canon, the Protestant view.
Can I briefly reply to that? And because I know the canon is going to open up a whole other perhaps can of worms, if you will. I disagree with you in Epiphanius very strongly. I think the reason I would is because we've got it even before there. It says, like the bodies of the saints. She's been held in honor, goes on and on right there. It says, she is like Elijah. So regardless of what kind of conclusion we get to, I think it is very clear that if she's like Elijah, and then he begins to list ways that she's like Elijah, I think the obvious conclusion is part of that is the translation into heaven. That is the way that I read it.
Okay, fair enough. So that's helpful. So we've drilled down into an area where we interpret that passage differently.
So again, we see Dr. Ortlund chooses not to agree or not to engage with the argument being made. He says, yeah, well, we'll just agree to disagree. And then he goes on to say, everybody should read the original source material for themselves. And I agree. But when you do that, you don't arrive at a conclusion that's going to agree with you, Dr. Ortlund. Not if you read it with an actual hermeneutic of honesty, with a hermeneutic of wanting, of understanding, and not just trying to defeat an argument. And beyond that, once again, your analogy to the bushes just falls apart. It is clear from the text that Saint Epiphanius is comparing Mary to Elijah in those things. Okay, so and the same with Saint John, and the same with Thecla. He is comparing the Blessed Virgin Mary to those people in the ways that he is talking about, right? So your analogy, which completely falls apart, is completely, it's not the same thing. It's not the same wording. So you said George W. Bush is an honorable president, and he actually does use this in the video that he asked me to engage with. He uses the same argument. However, I chose to use this clip from Reason and Theology because I wanted you to see the pushback from William Albrecht and how Dr. Ortlund deals with that pushback, which is that he didn't at all. But the analogy, he says George W. Bush was an honorable man like his father who served one term. But that's not what Saint Epiphanius was doing at all. You have to completely butcher the text in order to get that as being analogous. What would have been an honest analogy would have been to say George W. Bush was like his father in that he was an honorable man. He was president of the United States. He loved baseball. Those are all things that those two people have in common. And that's why you compare two people, to show two things that they have in common, or to show several things that they have in common. And you completely disregard what they have in common and just focus on, but he's talking about Elijah. Right, he's talking about Elijah in the context of what Elijah has in common with the Blessed Virgin Mary. Once again, we just see Dr. Ortlund being completely disingenuous. You are not, I stand by the title of my original video. You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in advancing Protestantism. That's not the truth. That's not seeking the truth. That's not being willing to die for the truth. That's having an agenda and being willing to die for your agenda. So we'll scratch that one off the list. And now you're down to 3. The diversity of the accounts. Okay, I'll give you that one because I don't see how that's relevant, because none of the accounts say what you want them to say. They say what they say, and then you fill in the gaps with what you want them to say. But sure, we'll give you that one. So you have 1. Acknowledgement of the late arrival. That is only true if you discount acknowledgments of possible earlier narratives, which I've already shown that you did. Stephen Shoemaker dates the Palm narratives to possibly the 2nd century. He dates the Book of Mary's Repose to at least the 3rd century, and there's good evidence to think that it's even earlier than that. So you still only get 1. We'll scratch that one on the list. And originating in heretical texts, which you cite the Book of Mary's Repose as a heretical text. It's not. It's apocryphal. And apocryphal does not necessarily mean heterodox. But you're accusing it of being heterodox without actually showing it to be heterodox. And again, that's just you making assumptions and making assertions that you're hoping that your audience is just going to follow blindly behind. And you do that again all of the time. You just say things and then hope people just go with it. Because when people actually look into what you're saying, then we see what we saw with the Agnus Domini clip that I played earlier, where you're completely full of crap. You're always telling your audience, don't take my word for it. Go read it for yourself. And then when we read it for ourselves, we find, oh, look at this. Dr. Ortlund has completely misrepresented this text. So, yeah, you have one thing that's even kind of specious, but out of charity, I gave it to you. You have one piece of evidence to stack on top of the silence. And I'm sorry, but your argument just doesn't hold. So everybody, this is already shaping up to be a long video. I did not get into anything that I really wanted to say to Dr. Ortlund in this video, apart from engaging in the video that he asked me to engage with. So I engaged with that video. There will definitely be a part 2 where I lay out the rest of my arguments on why I don't think that I was being uncharitable to Dr. Ortlund, and we will deal with the rest of his comment in the second part. Thank you everybody for joining me. If you found this video helpful, share it with your friends, share it in your social media groups. If you're not already subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. And make sweet, I almost forgot that part. Make sweet love to the notification bell. Thank you everybody for joining me. Go in peace and have a nice day.